Rome didn't fall to barbarians. It fell to its own tax collectors. Every empire fears invasion, but Rome's greatest enemy wasn't outside its borders. It was written in its own laws. For centuries, Rome conquered the world to fill its coffers, but in the end, the gold ran out and the taxes began. What kind of empire destroys itself in the name of saving itself? By the 3rd century after Christ, Rome ruled everything except its own economy. Its legions stood guard from the misty hills of Britain to the deserts of Syria. Its marble cities shimmered with wealth, fountains and art that touched the heavens. But behind the splendor, cracks were spreading. The endless conquests that had once filled Rome's treasuries had stopped. Trade faltered, coinage was diluted, and corruption ate through the empire's core. The glory that had once seemed eternal now depended on desperate measures. And so, in an effort to save itself, Rome turned on its own people. Welcome to Untold Civilizations, where the past reveals the present. In this episode, we'll uncover how one emperor's economic reform, meant to rescue a dying empire, ended up destroying it instead. You'll see how a single tax transformed a civilization, drained its people, and created a warning that still echoes through history. This is the story of one emperor, one law, and one tax that began the slow suicide of the Roman Empire. For centuries, Rome had thrived on motion, expansion, conquest, plunder. Each victory meant new gold, new slaves, new provinces. Every triumph funded the next campaign. Every campaign filled the treasury. It was a perfect cycle, glory feeding greed. The legions marched, merchants prospered, and emperors built monuments to eternity. But peace was expensive. When the frontier stabilized, the steady river of loot dried up. The empire still demanded the same luxuries: palaces, armies, circuses, baths, and bread for the hungry millions. But the gold that had fueled the machine was gone. Rome's economy was never built for peace. Its wealth had always depended on someone else's defeat. And now, without new wars to fight, the empire turned inward to pay for its ambitions. Emperors tried everything: new tributes, emergency levies, even melting down temple treasures. They debased the currency, mixing silver with cheap metals until a denarius was barely worth the bronze it was stamped on. But inflation only made life harder for the very citizens expected to save the empire. By the 3rd century, Rome had become a giant machine running out of oil. And in its desperation, it began to feed on its own citizens. When the wars stopped bringing treasure, Rome turned inward and began taxing itself. Then came Diocletian, the man who looked at a dying empire and decided to rebuild it with iron and numbers. He had crawled out of poverty, fought his way through the legions, and watched generals murder emperors like pawns on a board. When he seized power in 284 AD, Rome was a corpse still pretending to breathe. Civil war, famine, inflation. The empire was burning from the inside out. Diocletian was not a dreamer. He was an engineer of power. He divided the empire in two, surrounded himself with co-rulers, and tried to turn chaos into geometry. Every province, every soldier, every grain of wheat had to be accounted for. If order could not be born from faith, he would create it from fear. And to fund this new Rome, he created the Capitatio Iugatio, the most ambitious tax system the ancient world had ever seen. Inspectors marched across continents with scrolls and styluses, measuring the empire inch by inch. They counted cattle, weighed harvests, and wrote down the names of millions. The empire became a living spreadsheet, a colossal machine that knew the value of everything and the worth of everyone. At first, people marveled at the precision. It felt scientific, modern, inevitable. But soon, the weight of perfection crushed the human beneath it. To keep the record stable, no one was allowed to move. Farmers were bound to their fields. If your father made sandals, so would you. If your mother wove linen, you would weave until death. Freedom, once Rome's proudest invention, vanished under wax seals and signatures. Tax collectors became symbols of terror. They arrived flanked by soldiers, demanding quotas that even good harvests could not meet. Families buried their coins or fled by night. Some sold their children to pay arrears. Others vanished into the wilderness, choosing hunger over taxation. Diocletian had wanted efficiency, but what he built was a perfect machine for despair. The emperor's reforms gave Rome order, but stripped it of its soul. It was the calm of a statue, majestic, motionless, and dead inside. What began as reform became control. What began as control became despair. And the machine that was Rome began to grind itself to dust. At first, the reports from the provinces seemed ordinary. A poor harvest here, a missing census there. But within a decade, the silence spread like rot. The fertile plains of North Africa, the fields of Gaul, the valleys of Anatolia, empty. Farmers abandoned their land in droves. Villages vanished. Tax registers listed the names of ghosts. Officials called it treason. The people called it survival. As food production collapsed, prices exploded. A loaf of bread cost what once bought a month's grain. Coins lost their shine. Pure silver had become dull bronze. Merchants closed their stalls. Cities shrank, and beggars filled the marble steps of temples built for gods that no longer answered. Desperate, Diocletian tried one last miracle: the edict on maximum prices. He declared that no one in the empire could sell goods above a fixed rate, that anyone who disobeyed would die. Markets froze overnight. Farmers refused to sell. Trade moved to the shadows. The empire that once ruled commerce by the sword was now strangling it with ink. The denarius became worthless, wages meaningless. Soldiers demanded to be paid in food and cloth. Legions that once marched for glory now marched for rations. Yet the government's solution to every problem was the same: more taxes. Each failure required another decree, another inspection, another layer of bureaucracy. The machine that had promised to save Rome was devouring its own fuel, its people. Revolts erupted from Gaul to Egypt. Peasants formed rebel armies called Bagodai, attacking tax offices and freeing slaves. To the empire, they were criminals. To the starving, they were liberators. But the rebellion only deepened the spiral. To crush revolt, more troops were sent. To feed troops, more taxes were raised. And to collect taxes, more laws were written. By the dawn of the 4th century, the Roman world was collapsing under its own paperwork. Granaries stood empty. Treasuries overflowed with worthless records. A civilization that once conquered continents now couldn't feed its capital. By trying to squeeze gold from stone, Rome had crushed the hands that built its greatness. And when the barbarians finally came, they did not destroy a living empire. Why, they simply pushed over a hollow shell. By the time the empire realized what had happened, there was nothing left to fix. The farms were gone. The merchants were gone. Even hope was gone. The capitatio iugatio, Diocletian's proud system, lived on like a ghost, taxing fields that no longer produced and citizens who no longer existed. Scribes copied figures from ledgers written a generation earlier, pretending the empire still functioned. In the cities, silence ruled. Aqueducts cracked and ran dry. Statues of emperors stared over marketplaces turned to dust. The bathhouses, once roaring with laughter, were now echoing tombs of marble and shadow. Yet the emperors still held parades. They still wore gold crowns and declared victory over invisible enemies. They believed Rome's power was eternal, because on paper it was. But outside the walls, Rome had already disappeared. When the Goths entered the city in 410 AD, they found little resistance, no thunder of legions, no walls of spears, only a city waiting to be looted. The conquerors came not as invaders, but as witnesses to an empire that had quietly killed itself. Empires don't fall in an instant. They fade, one law at a time, one tax at a time, until all that remains is memory. The fall of Rome wasn't just a story of swords and barbarians. It was an economic tragedy, a slow suffocation under the weight of its own perfection, a warning for every nation that confuses control with stability and mistakes obedience for strength. The marble cracked long before the walls fell, and in those cracks, history whispers, you cannot tax a civilization into greatness. The tax that was meant to save Rome became the tax that bankrupted it. Rome tried to measure everything except the cost of its own greed. History remembers the wars, the generals, the emperors, but the true downfall of the empire began not on the battlefield, but in the counting rooms of men who believed numbers could control the world. If history teaches one thing, it's that power never collapses from without. It erodes from within. Even the mightiest empire can be undone by its own laws, its own fear, its own ambition. You've been watching Untold Civilizations, where the past reveals the present, and the stories of forgotten empires remind us how fragile power truly is.